Today, what I'd like to see from Nikon's newly announced Z9 body, as well as other mirrorless bodies that they and other brands produce. I'll talk with my good friends that are Sony shooters and DSLR shooters, and just kind of provide a broad perspective on where mirrorless is headed, why it's exciting and awesome, and where we hope it all goes. Well, hey everybody, Hudson here. Welcome to this week's Approaching the Scene. We're going to talk about sort of the future of mirrorless technology, both with relation to Nikon's newly announced Nikon Z9, as well as all the other camera brands and where mirrorless is headed, and just kind of a wish list for things to happen in the future. I don't know exactly what the Z9 is going to be like. I'm not even going to hypothesize. I'm just going to give you a wish list of mine, as well as my good friend Rick, who's primarily a Sony shooter's kind of wish list for camera development going forward, as well as my good friend David Archer, who mainly still shoots DSLRs but is enjoying his Z6 II. He's largely a D5 shooter. So we'll talk about some different perspectives. And I'm going to wrap it up with a video of Rick and I in North Central Oregon in a really beautiful location having a discussion about all the different brands, where they've gone with mirrorless, what it means, why it's such an interesting renaissance period for photo equipment, and why all that really doesn't matter nearly as much as you developing your art and your knowledge of the tools that you have. So that's where this episode's going. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's been liking, sharing, subscribing, and directing the content on this Approaching the Scene channel. Again, I do videos about what all of you are interested in and want to know, so I pay really close attention to the comments that you leave here on YouTube, to the emails that you send me, to the questions that you submit when you sign up for my free office hours. We're going to be doing another free set of office hours on March 23rd, Tuesday, March 23rd, 10 a.m. Sign up for that. You can participate on Zoom. We can see all your faces and interact. You can also be on YouTube Live. You can submit a question when you sign up. We're going to talk about mastering contrast and tone and using your histogram both in the field and in your edit to make sure that you have the image captured and edited the way that you really realize that vision that you had out in the field. So kind of a fun topic of discussion, and I hope I'll see you there, and I hope you'll submit questions. So I'm going to do a quick series of wishes of mine. You know, Nikon has announced the Z9. All I know is a little shadow outline of what it's going to look like. It's going to be a bigger pro build style with dual grips, which is not my favorite. Talk about that in a second. Kind of violates one of my wishes, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And I don't know, I don't know what sensor's going to be in it, except that it's stacked. I imagine it's going to be pretty high megapixel. It's going to kind of be a larger competitor to the Sony A1. But let me talk about a wish list for things I want to see moving forward from all the brands, but maybe Nikon in particular at different points, and just for all the brands at others. So one thing Nikon I feel needs to do is move the play button. Nikon's kept a wonderful ergonomic system from the days of film to today, where Nikon cameras just feel good in your hands and the controls are where you expect them if you've ever been a Nikon shooter. But they need to move the play button, because in the days of the DSLR, you'd shoot, and when you wanted to review your images, you looked down at the LCD and you hit play. Your hand was back there already on the top left side. It was a good, sensible position. Now in the days of mirrorless, you shoot, and you want to keep looking through that viewfinder, through your diopter adjusted, magnificent, high definition, beautifully colored viewfinder to see what you've got. And it should be a button that you could reach with your thumb without having to take your hand off of a heavy lens to come back and hit this awkward button that's by your nose on the top left. So they really need to move that, and everybody I've talked to says they need to move that. Sony's got theirs in the right spot. Take a look at that. Simplifying the autofocus. Right now Nikon, I think they're berated overly for autofocus issues. I think their autofocus is simply brilliant in AFS mode. The eye detect for autofocus continuous is amazing. I can't get an image out of focus with my kids or my cat, and I find it works a lot with wildlife despite not being rated for it, and I'm sure it will increase to add birds and wildlife very soon through firmware updates like they are so good at doing. But the one thing that I think could be simplified is selecting a subject to track when it's not obvious. Nikon does an amazing job in auto area autofocus selecting what subject it is that you actually think is important, particularly if that subject is frame filling and you're tracking with it. It does a magnificent job without you selecting any point at all. and so do the other brands. I think that some of the other brands have gotten a little bit more nuanced with their ability to flip into a mode where you select what the subject is and track that subject moving through the frame. Nikon's subject tracking is good. Out of the box, you need to modify the camera to make it easy to use. Otherwise, your thumb is dancing all over the back of the camera, turning it on and turning it off. If you go through my Z6 II, Z7 II setup or my Z6, Z7 setup videos, which I'll link in the description of this video, I show you how to set that up so that it's under your infrequently used ring finger for your action mode, and it's easy to turn on and turn off when you need it, when you need to identify that thing that you're tracking. But I think that moving forward, all the camera brands should be looking to companies like Skydio. I have a drone from a company named Skydio, and I'll put a link to it in the video. And if you watch its video, you'll see what I mean, the video on their website. This drone is more of an autonomous drone. It tracks subjects that you identify. And when you're flying it with your controller, with your phone, any person or vehicle that shows up in the frame has a little plus over it. And if you touch the plus, the drone automatically starts autofocusing and tracking that subject. And you can say what angle you want it to be at, what distance away you want it to be. The fact that that's available with on-sensor technology through the little drone sensor tells me that the camera companies can do that too with the processing power that they have. I'd like to see every person, animal, or vehicle that the camera identifies have a different colored little marker over the top. And if you're in a place where your voice doesn't matter, you could just say red. The camera has the microphone built in. You could say red and it starts tracking the red subjects. You don't have to move your hand at all. Green, blue. If you're in a place where you're working and it has to be quiet, you could use the joystick to select, just like you can with eyes right now. And the fact that you can move from animal eye to animal eye, from human eye to human eye right now with the joystick and select which one you want the camera tracking tells me it can do it with subjects in general. So that's a processing, sort of algorithmic, smart processing thing that could come, and I'd love to see it with all the camera brands. It's just going to make our life even that little bit simpler. I'd like Nikon, in particular, to fix the depth of field preview issue with the Z cameras that I've been complaining about since the original Z6 and Z7 came out. I'll link a video on that. It has not been fixed. When you're in stills mode, you can't preview your final aperture at apertures smaller than f5.6 at 100%, or at any view except fit view. If you're in looking at the entire scene and you touch the depth of field preview button, it'll stop down past f5.6 and let you see the image at final aperture. But if you're zoomed in to check critical focus, say out in the distance or in your closest subject, and you press the depth of field preview button, it goes back to a fit view and you don't get to see with fine detail whether that subject that's important to you is in focus or not. And that is just a limitation that makes no sense to me. It's not a limitation with my old DSLRs like the D850 or the D500, and it's not a limitation in video mode on these same cameras. So I'd love to see them do a firmware update and not have that limitation on future bodies. I would like to see the clean view option on the display when you're shooting. It has a lot of exposure data available, and people complained there's no option for just a completely clear view, and that's a valid complaint. So for the Z6 II and Z7 II, they added to the menu of options you can program buttons for a clear view. And that means you have to burn one of your programmable buttons. I use those buttons for really critical things, and I don't want to burn one for the clear view. There's a big display button. It only has like 5 options. I would be fine pushing it one more time and having one of those options be a completely clear display. It just makes sense to me to put that as a display button option in the rotation. So, and I think that's the way Sony does theirs. So that would be fantastic. I would like, I'd like the grip to be optional. I've never cared for vertical grips, and I'm a guy who loves to take vertical images. Probably the vast majority of my portfolio images that are single frame are vertical. I shoot a lot of panoramas where I'm holding the camera vertical, even if I'm doing handheld panoramas, and I shoot vertical frames, and I sort of see the world that way. I have to force myself to turn back to landscape orientation. So, you know, for me, shooting like this is just natural, and it's as easy as just rotating my wrist a little bit. My controls don't change. I don't have to realign. When I watch people working with those big pro build cameras like the Z9 is going to be, I see them rotate and then move their hand around and get their fingers back on the controls. You'll probably never see me do that. I'll probably have those big old controls sitting off to the side, not using them. And it also the one great thing I love with the Z cameras is I put them in my camera bag. They're about the same width as most of my lenses, and I just drop them into the same size slot that I would put, say, a 70-200 in. You know, if I've got my 50 millimeter or my 24-70 or my 20 millimeter on, I just drop it into a slot. It's even shorter than my 70-200. It's like a lens slot in my case instead of having to have it bow out and have a place for the body. And I love that. That's a huge, great change from a space perspective for me. The bodies being smaller doesn't save us all that much weight because we're still shooting full frame cameras with big lenses. But having it fit differently in my bag has been great, and I don't relish the idea of a bigger body. And we have external battery power, so we don't, you know, you can power the camera via USB-C, so I'm not too worried about having a whole bunch of extra battery power for night shoots or time lapse or things where I'm on a tripod and I can just hook a power delivery battery brick into the camera. So I just don't have a need for it, and I wish that they would make that an option. And I hope that if this camera has mind-bending capabilities that I really need, they offer some of those same things in a smaller body replacement to the Z7 before long. I would like to have 2-button format back on the body where, you know, if I want to format my memory card, I could be having a discussion with you and there's 2 buttons that I hold down that have dual function. If I hold them for 2 seconds, up flashes format memory card, yes or no, and I could switch with my dial which memory card I'm formatting and press it again and it formats. That's just simple. I don't want to have to dive into menus to format my memory card. It feels like a thing that was taken away. I love the backlit buttons on the D500 and the D850. I've already talked about how external power makes power consumption really not such a big deal. When I use the EVF priority, the viewfinder priority, I find the battery lasts just about as long as I was used to with my D850 and my D500. So, you know, I wouldn't mind it lasting a little bit less, and if I pulled that power switch over and wanted it, I would have all the buttons light up just with a little soft glow that's nice for night shooting. That was great on those cameras, and I miss it. I'd like it to bring it back. I'd like a dedicated bracketing button instead of having to burn one of my custom buttons to get bracketing out of the menus. You know, again, if you look at my setup videos, I talk about where I think it's intelligent to put that bracketing button, but it'd be nice to just give us one of those back, particularly if they're going to have a bigger body like this. I'd like to have dual compact flash express B card slots if they're going to have dual slots. To me, an SD slot, I don't want to deal with SDs anymore. After working with XQDs and compact flash express type B cards, they're so much more durable, more robust, faster. The SD cards feel like a really fragile toy card after you've been using those other cards for a while. So if you're going to give us dual slots, give us 2 good card slots is sort of how I would think about it. And then from a video perspective, I'd like better audio preamps. I think on all the cameras could use that aside from maybe Panasonic, which does really good audio preamps. There's a lot of background noise if you turn up the amplification of the audio coming into any of the current Z cameras. And up until I got these Hollyland wireless mics that have really low signal to noise ratio and a really loud signal directly out of them, I used to run my audio through a field recorder to amplify it and then into the camera with no amplification, maybe level 1, just to avoid that hiss that's inherent. So let's get rid of that. And with the fast processing and with the fast memory cards that these cameras have, let's do 10-bit internal N-Log video recording. For those that understand what that means, I won't dwell on it, but to have to go out via HDMI to an external recorder like the Adamus Ninja 5 just seems unnecessary. I'm sure they could do the 10-bit log recording. Also, it'd be nice if it came straight from the factory, ready for ProRes RAW when you're shooting out to these recorders instead of having to send them in and pay to have them modified for that. When I talked to David Archer, who shoots a lot with the D5, the D500, the D850, but is really enjoying his Z6 II, he still notices a little bit that there's a tiny bit of shutter lag. He loves the amplified view, he loves the viewfinder, but when he's shooting action in burst mode, he'd like there to be no lag, and I think that that's probably coming in the next versions of the camera. I think the Z6 II and the Z7 II have less lag than the Z6 and the Z7, and it was not a deal breaker for me on the originals. And I've been using them enough, I've just gotten used to it. I can track action just fine with it, but it's a complaint that he has he'd like to see slightly improved, and he'd like that play button moved. But his overall statement was he loves it so much, he'll be leaving the D5 at home unless it's a serious wildlife-oriented trip that he's going on. He doesn't feel the need to be lugging the big old body around anymore, and he loves the new glass too. My friend Rick LePage, who shot Nikon film cameras, Sony or Canon DSLRs, then Nikon for a little while when the D800 came out before switching to Sony's for the mirrorless technology, and he's still a Sony shooter ordering the A1 here. He would like the play button to move. He'd like a slightly simplified autofocus system like I'm talking about. I just feel like you have to bump around in the tracking mode a little bit, bouncing between subject tracking and auto area tracking. Takes work. It works really well once you get the hang of it, but it takes work to do. And I think they can improve on that. And clearly he'd like the play button to move to the right. And he agrees he'd like to have that grip optional. David Archer loves having the vertical grip. He's been shooting with the D5 forever and the D4 before that. Different people have different desires. For me, I'd really like to have that be an option instead of mandatory. So that's basically kind of my wish list. I think what I want to do now is jump over to a discussion that Rick and I had out in the field, out near the John Day River, on a really beautiful but cold evening with some beautiful windmills spinning behind us. So I'm out here north central Oregon with Rick, and we've been shooting around a little bit for our long exposure project, which we're running right now, and we both shot a lot of different camera brands. I've obviously been Nikon for a really long time. Rick was briefly Nikon for a while. You were Canon, Sony, or Canon, Nikon, Sony.
I was Nikon in film days.
Yeah.
And then went to Canon when they came out with the D30 back in 2000. And I went whole hog into the Canon ecosystem, and they just weren't catching up. And when the D800 came out, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna jump, and so I jumped. I kept a lot of the Canon gear just in case, and I love Nikon. I actually had a lot of fun shooting with that D800.
That's a great camera.
Yeah.
I came really close to jumping Nikon ship and going over to Canon in the days before the D800 released, because all they had was 12 megapixel cameras and all the Canons were 24, and I needed more resolution. But now we've got the mirrorless game, and it's clear that all the R&D is headed into mirrorless, and DSLR's days are, I'm not going to say they're gone forever, but they're going on the back burner at least of everyone's product development chart.
They'll be retro in about 10 years.
They'll be retro in about 10 years, absolutely. Yeah. And you've been shooting a fair bit with the Z6,
right,
as well as your A7R3?
A7R3, yes.
Right. Well, you've had a lot of different A7 cameras.
Yeah.
And so, what we thought is, I've been shooting with the I've been shooting with the Z7 II, the Z6 II, having shot the entire life of the Z6 and the Z7. And I thought I'd talk about some of the things that I absolutely love about the system, as well as some things I'd like to see them address moving forward with their newer camera designs. And have Rick chime in too, because he's coming from a more Sony and Canon perspective than I am. I truly am just kind of looking at this as a Nikon shooter saying, here are some things I'd like to see changed. For me, the biggest benefits to these cameras are the low light focusing, especially with the Z6 II and the Z7 II, the ability to focus on a star at night. With the Z6 and Z7, I could focus on planets, but I can use the pinpoint low light autofocus and nail focus on a star. I was doing that last night on a moonless night without even any bright Milky Way in the sky, and it was nailing it every time. Or just a very faintly lit grasses in the foreground, boom, just nailing autofocus and not having to worry about it. That combined with the quality of the lenses that they've been building for this big, newer, wider mount. I think that's one thing Nikon did really, really well, was making a bigger mount with a shorter flange distance between the back glass and the sensor. Has just opened the world up for their engineers to build lenses that are doing things I wouldn't have thought possible. Yeah. I thought I loved my old top Nikon F glass, but the S glass just uniformly is blowing every one of those lenses out of the water. And I find myself selling lots and lots of F glass right now and holding tighter and tighter to the new S glass. Now, Rick, your experience with the 24 to 70 f4.
Right. I was going to say, so first of all, I'm borrowing Hudson's old Z6. I'm not switching to Sony, or switching from Sony at this point.
Right.
But we teach workshops together. There are a lot of Nikon shooters who come to these things. It's good to have familiarity with other
as well as people. We get Sony shooters and Canon shooters and Olympus shooters all the time too.
But I will say that as a longtime Sony shooter, when you first got the Z6 and the Z7, and we went out and did a couple of workshops, and I put it in my hands and did a little bit of shooting with it, when we were in Death Valley.
Yeah.
I instantly fell in love with the camera. I mean, one of the things that I loved about the D800 back in the day was, after years of Canon, which had an okay interface, it just felt more like me. It felt more like a photographer's interface, the way the buttons were laid out, the way the menus were laid out, that sort of thing.
Bigger grip with more room for your hand.
And playing with the Z6 in the last couple of weeks, one of the things that we in the past used to get hung up about was an f4 zoom, right? You don't buy those. You really want the 2.8 zooms.
Yeah.
And I have to say that this 24 to 70 f4S lens is one of the nicest lenses I've used in a long time.
Yeah, I've never bought the 2.8 because I think the f4 is so sweet, so small, fits in the bag so nicely, balances right. And f4, it's sharp corner to corner.
Yeah. And so I've also been, I've got a mount or an adapter that lets me mount my Sony lenses onto the Z, and that's been kind of fun.
Yeah.
And actually, it was really fun because I put the Nikon to FE mount and then my Canon EF to FE mount.
So the Nikon to Sony and then the Sony to Canon stacked on the camera.
With my 16 to 35 f2.8L lens from way back when, which I just adore. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing about this whole group of cameras, right? Is that you can do that sort of stuff.
You can trade stuff around.
Yeah. Sony's come quite a ways since the first days of the A7 and the A7R.
They have.
And the newer cameras, the new one, the A1, the A7S3, and whatever will be the successor to the A7R4, Sony's been working on their menu system, their
ergonomics, weather sealing.
Yeah. And so, they'll get there. I don't think that, if you had me pick one today, I'd probably stick with the Sony just because I'm familiar with it.
Sure.
And I've got all of these lenses that work with it, despite the fact I could mount them, back and forth.
But they're going to work better in the native system.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. The handling is wonderful. It just feels so good in your hands.
Yeah.
But of course, the one thing that just drives me crazy is the play button up top on the left side.
Well, and that's something that David Archer's talked to me a lot about too. And it's funny because in the days of DSLR, you're shooting. You want to look at images, you drop it down and you touch that top button with your thumb. I mean, it makes sense, right? You're already looking down at the screen anyway. Nowadays, when we're shooting, I want to just be able to tap with that finger without taking my hand off the lens and view the image in the viewfinder. And so, yeah.
Which
Nikon.
is exactly, and Sony's got their play button is right on the bottom right. And that's, another thing is
smart.
That, when we talk about Z versus A7s versus the new Canon R5 and R6, the reality is, as we've been saying for a long time,
all the cameras are amazing.
We are in a renaissance of mirrorless cameras. I mean, yes, DSLR sales are dying. There's no sort of middle ground between the smartphone and the mirrorless systems, but it's hard to go wrong today. It really is.
Any of the surviving systems.
Yeah.
The other thing I adore that all these top mirrorless systems have is the eye detect autofocus. Whether you're shooting people or pets or some animals, I know Nikon's isn't up to where it talks about wildlife yet, but yet I've had it registering eyes with birds and with mammals, besides cats and dogs. But with people, it's crazy. Like, I just never get a shot that's out of focus of my little preschool kids bouncing around at full speed. If my shutter speed's up and I have that mode on and they come into where they're any kind of frame filling, the eye just locks. It's amazing. And I think the whole auto area autofocus system in Nikon and Sony has a similar thing where it's really sort of like matrix metering or evaluative metering, where it is looking at a whole library of possible scenes and determining what it thinks you're trying to capture, what's the tone balance that would be appropriate for your image. Those have gotten so good. Well, the autofocus is doing the same thing now, reading the sensor, and it's saying what subject on this scene that the computer is seeing is what should be in focus, and whoop, locking it without you even choosing a point. It's choosing the points for you.
Yeah.
And I mean, and then there's an override where you can say, no, I want it to be this, and you can hit a button. I like that to be a front function button, and just say that's what I want locked, and lock it in as long as I'm holding. But it's a whole game changer. It really does make it easier to focus in on what's my background, what's my shutter speed. It's locking focus for me in a whole new way.
And this is one of the things that I think this discussion leads to, which is you got to know your gear, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So many times we're out in the field and you see someone who's looks at your Z7 or my A7, and they're like, oh, I want one of those, and it's like, my camera doesn't do this, and it's like, well, most cameras today do this.
Yeah.
What you really need to do is focus in on how to get the camera to act the way you want.
Yep.
Understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the lenses that you have. Understand your sensor. Where's your where are your limits for noise that you have to be careful about? So you set your auto ISO properly.
Right.
I mean, going
practice.
out there, practice. Yes, it is. It's practice. You go out and you practice with your camera so that when you get into these great situations, these beautiful areas with light, that you're already ahead because you've gone and you've done that practice. You've played with your lens. You know which lens you want to use there. You know what your filters do.
Yep.
And you've got your camera set up so that you've got it the way you need it to work in the field.
Yeah. And that's something that you don't get that and just hold on to it forever. You have to keep practicing. It's just like an athlete. It's just like a musician, any artist. If you sit on your laurels and are just hanging out with the family like I've been doing a fair bit lately and get out here in the field, it doesn't necessarily mean that you remember exactly how it was zipping for you the last time you were out shooting for 3 weeks straight and had everything dialed. Things get rusty. You need to get out and work. And so that's why practice is so important. We talk a lot about that. Even if you're at home and you're not in some kind of a great inspiring place, take your gear and go practice with it. Even if you don't get anything that's a keeper image that you want to print large in your home, you're practicing, you're ready. Then when you get into the spectacular scenery where you want that image, you're ready to get it.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say about Nikon that I really would like to see them change in their future cameras, I would like them to move the no information on the display. There's a button on the Z6 and Z7 II. You can program any of the buttons to touch it, and it takes all the information off the display, and you just have a clean view of what the sensor sees. And that's a really nice feature, but I'm using all my custom buttons, and I think it would be nice if they just put that in the rotation from the display button, where that's one of the choices. I would be fine with hitting the button one more time to cycle through the optional displays to have the clean display be keyed into that button.
Sorry, I've got that on mine.
Yeah, exactly. I do burn it on a button for video work because I really need to see the frame for video work, but I don't for still photography. The other thing is they still have a limitation where you can't zoom into 100% and view your image at final aperture at anything narrower than f5.6. If you go to f11 and you zoom into 100%, you can, but it's still only going to show you f5.6 unless you hit the depth of field preview lever. And when you do that, it zooms back out. I have a whole video about that. I'll link it in this video's description. You can see what I'm talking about. I've talked to Nikon. They say the engineers are looking at it. I'm just hoping that the next cameras or firmware for the current cameras address that, because it's really a nice thing doing landscape photography to be able to look front to back.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm pretty pleased. I mean,
you should be.
Yeah.
This is, so what? This is last generation at this point, right?
Right.
And it's a wonderful camera.
It is, yeah. And I think of the Z6 II and the Z7 II as kind of it's 1.5. It's not 2.0. It just addresses some of the features. It adds that second slot, which I use for video. I'm not backing up all my images while I shoot in the field. It's great to have a second slot with a big SD card for video. And it has a little bit better autofocus and faster responsiveness at all the autofocus work that it does, mainly because of dual processing. Just everything runs a little faster, and it has a much bigger buffer. So if you do shoot sports in action, you're not going to run out of buffer like you did with the originals. So the other thing for me is there's just a few little things. You know, it has a mode now where you can go past 30 seconds for shutter speed, and it's a little bit unique, I think, in that you can go to 2.5 hours and it continues to meter. It's a mode you can turn on, and all of a sudden bulb is past 2.5 hours. Still moves in thirds of a stop. It's pretty great. I was using that last night for the Milky Way with exposure delay mode, and I didn't need any external trigger whatsoever, or even an external remote, because I just push the shutter, make it wait a second, and do a 2.5 minute exposure. And it also has an ability to remember exactly where your last focus was, even if you've taken the lens off and spun that focus by wire ring on an S lens and put it back on. When you turn the camera back on, it focuses right where it was before. That's really sweet for night work.
I have to say that when I saw the Z7 and the going past bulb mode last night, I was like, why is it taking so long with these cameras to get to this place?
I know the R5 can do it too. So I have a frequent workshop flyer who just got the R5 and was asking about it, and I looked into the manuals, but they do it in a kind of funny way where there's a bulb timer setting in the menu where you can go turn it on and then how long do you want bulb to be, but it doesn't meter and just extend the shutter speed times like the Z cameras. That's a pretty cool feature.
Yeah. It's a funny thing.
It is a funny thing. Anyhow, so I think that by and large the biggest takeaway is that all the cameras out there are great. The Z cameras, there's a lot of things that are just kicking butt in. There's a few little things that they could fix, but remember we're on version 1.5. There's a lot of room to run. We got a whole runway ahead. So
well, and every camera has their set of little things that drive you crazy.
Exactly. All right, everybody. Thanks, Rick.
Yep.
We're going to get out and shoot before the lake gets any better.
Yeah.
All right. Good times with Rick in a beautiful, beautiful place. I can't wait to get out with all the workshop participants and my friends, collaborating and doing creative adventures, taking pictures in beautiful places again. It's going to be happening really, really soon. You know, my first workshop is going to be kicking off. You know, post-pandemic workshop is going to be kicking off at the end of August, starts August 31st through September 3rd in Brookings, Oregon. Spectacular reach of the southern Oregon coast. I'll be launching that really soon. A number of people asked for reserved spots already. Hit me up. And we'll be doing Yellowstone Tetons and Moab. Rick and I and David Archer will be coming along on that in the fall, in October. I'm looking forward to those. Cuba is in November. There's not very many places left in Cuba. I haven't launched the big parks workshops yet, but a lot of people have asked for spots in that. I'll have all that out as soon as I can get them up on the web. You know, as far as the Z9 goes, obviously we filmed that before the Z9 was announced. It's an interesting camera from my perspective. I'll be very curious to see what improvements it brings to the Z system. You've got my list of hopes. Obviously, the form of it is larger than I would have wished for. It'll be interesting to see if it's so good I have to keep it. I'll get one of the earliest ones. I'll shoot the heck out of it and review it. Whether I keep it or not, that's another question. I really do love the Z6 II and the Z7 II, and they're the right size for me. And there's not much that I really want improved, just a few little things. So we'll wait, we'll see. Again, I hope you'll think of joining up on the office hours on the 23rd, 10 a.m. Pacific. Give me a question when you sign up at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. Gear links that are my affiliate links for those of you who want to help support what I do are at hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. Again, there's all the stuff that we talked about in videos are linked in the video's description. Just run in there and have a look at it. Thanks everybody for supporting this channel, for sticking through to the end of this video. It's a good long one. I hope you're all staying safe, staying creative, and we'll see you next week.